are the remaining speakers of today here? Can they just maybe in chat send me a message that I know who is actually giving the talk afterwards?
Okay, I will try again. Okay, normally now should work. I will share here. No, it's not working. Oh my God, I don't know why.
You want to try again with sharing, or should we move one of the other talks first?
I will try again.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know why it's not working now, because it was working, but it seems that there some problem. Yes.
Sometimes, if I may add wisdom, it is that the windows are showing on a different desktop screen. So if you do gather windows or put them all in one, that usually works better.
Okay. So now you see something?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And well, yeah. So maybe I will stay like that if you don't mind, because I think that when I try to put it in a slideshow, it doesn't work. I don't know why.
It's fine with me.
Okay, good. So sorry for this delay. So the talk of today is about blockchain consensus of economic incentives, and most part of the work actually that I will present today is a work that I've done with some collaborators, particular Yekalia Musugenu, Bruno Bier, and Maria Butukar. So before entering all the details of the talk, I just wanted to make a point about the history of Bitcoin, because when we talk about blockchain consensus, of course, we are talking about Bitcoin somehow. This is the first technology that actually came up with the concept of blockchain, right? And in fact, what is interesting is that from the early 80s, this vision of digital money has been around somehow, but it took more than a quarter century before a fully decentralized solution became a reality. So first tries were systems in which, for instance, we have the concept of untraceability of exchanges. Second tries of systems were kind of discovering how proof of work could also serve as a mechanism to mint money, to create fresh money. And then later in 2000 years, there were this idea of trying to decentralize the way in which actual transactions are validated in the system, in particular to avoid multiple spending and token forgery. Because in the first system, in some sense, there were some trusted entities that were there to avoid multiple spending and token forgery. So the idea was to see if, for instance, visiting quorums could help with that, but this was vulnerable to similar attacks and so on and so on. So there are so many ideas, and then all ideas have been combined in Bitcoin to actually decentralize this validation of a transaction. And in fact, what does it mean is that when you want to decentralize this validation, somehow you are trying to ensure a consensus among participants about the history of the log of the register in which you register transaction, right? And the fact that is you want to ensure that this immutable history can be served as a truth, as a base of truth. This is important because there is no external authority that can do this work, right? So it is not exactly the sense of consensus as in distributed computing, is less formal somehow, and I will go back to this sense after, but the idea is to have this consensus on the status of the ledger. And when you say the status of the ledger, of course, this shared history that we have in the register in the ledger can be anything. Can be transaction for Bitcoin, can be sequence of metal costs for smart contract in Ethereum, for instance, or logs of any data in kind of different kind of applications, industrial application that we can see around now. So the question now is how to achieve consensus blockchains. And the answer is easy: design a good blockchain consensus protocol. But as what this we have seen before, it took more than 30 years to get Bitcoin, right? So it's not so easy to do it. So just to have this, all the audience on the same page, I will recall briefly how Bitcoin works, the essentials of the protocol. This is very simple. So it's a protocol based on mining. Mining is the procedure to create and append a new block in the blockchain. So block is a set of transaction that is chained to the previous block. And mining consists in solving a puzzle and also to prove that actually the solution has been found to the others. And this puzzle difficulty is that just somehow to have a block every 10 minutes, but byproduct, the protocol actually could achieve multiple chains at the same time. So somehow these multiple chains can actually appear even though there is no attack, just because a bad behavior of the networks appears and that we have recent different partitions. So the idea is that this is actually taken into account by a reconciliation rule that is a consensus there to choose a unique state of the ledger, which is the unique chain. So you need to choose among these multiple chain, one chain. And this is a rule that you have to think about. And this is the rule that is used in Bitcoin. So in practice, when we talk about Nakamoto cell consensus, we are referring to two different things. First, the proof of work, which limits the number of concurrent proposals. When I say proposal, it's not just one block, it could be a chain of block. And the longest J rule, that actually is the reconciliation rule that help us to choose a unique chain in case multiple chains appear in the system. What is interesting is that, which is completely new, and this is actually the point I want to make today, is that Bitcoin brings also economic incentives. This is pretty natural because Bitcoin is about exchange money, which is digital money. So why don't actually remunerate those that works for the system to be consistent, to be stable, to give to them some money. And in practice, this is important because proof of work is costly as a computational cost. So the idea is also to encourage people to choose the longest chain rule and to propose a reward for all the proposals that actually get a consensus. So all the proposals, the blocks that actually fall magically in the unique chain that is chosen by all the participants. Rewards come from transaction fees and also mentioning fresh coins, of course. What is interesting, when you talk about incentives, immediately you are talking about rational participants. So those that respond to incentives, right? I could choose to invest some hardware and everything in Bitcoin because maybe I want to gain some money from it, right? And in fact, this is so important that economists are also looking at rational behavior inside Bitcoin and to figure out how this rational behavior actually is. And there is a theorem, and it's a nice work from Bruno Bier and other authors that is called the Bitfork theorem. They say that if agents are profit seekers, then the protocol, so the Nakamoto cell consensus that we have seen before, is a Nash equilibrium. This is a very important concept, Nash equilibrium, because it is a way of saying that somehow this protocol is a good protocol. Why? Because if all the others will follow the protocol, I have no interest in deviating from the protocol. And the intuition of the proof, I'll just give you the intuition. Of course, I will not introduce any mathematical notation here in the talk, but the intuition is that, first of all, a miner has a finite resources. Cost is proportional to the number of extended branches. And the miner will get a reward if the branch his block belongs to persists, is chosen by all the others. So if the miner anticipates that all the other miners will extend the longest chain rule, so the good behavior for him, the best response for him is also to choose the longest chain rule. And this is exactly Nash equilibrium. Two observations here are the following. First is from a rational point of view, adjoint point of view, any common rule is actually a Nash equilibrium. If we have any other common rule, could be you have to choose, I don't know, the green chain out of all the colors that you see. Of course, this is not the case, but just to say that if there is another rule that is proposed by the protocol, this also is a Nash equilibrium. And the second observation is that the protocol is not only the unique equilibrium of the system. There are other equilibria that exist, and these other equilibria are not leading to consensus. This is important because sometimes when you want to design a protocol, we want to check if this protocol is a Nash equilibrium, but we also need to check if there are other Nash equilibrium that exist that are deviating from the expected outcome, which is consensus. So all the works on Bitcoin are so many works. We were interested in another class of blockchains, which is not Bitcoin. I will introduce in a short time. We wanted to study something else because, of course, Bitcoin has some issues. And the first issue is the huge energy consumption, of course. And there are different kinds of estimation, ranging from the most optimistic to the least optimistic. I would say that the cost per transaction consumption per transaction is between 1 and 20 days of an American average household, according to this estimation, which is huge, right? And there's another problem is that, of course, transaction finalization is very slow. It's quite long because you need to wait at least 6 blocks to be produced to consider transaction finalized in a block that actually is followed from by other 6. And there is also this byproduct problem is that the fact that if you have multiple chains at some point of time, you could have some conflicted states or multiple states of the ledger at the same time, and you want to choose after reconciliation one state. It means that maybe some of the transactions that you had before can be revoked later, right? And this is also can be an issue. So to actually address at least the first 2 problems, proof of stake blockchains have been developed. And the proof of stake blockchain actually are based on a different system. They are not based on proof of work. So to choose actually the leader, that this is very simple. You have in the blockchain the transactions that are registered. So you have the balance of all the participants in the system. You rank the balance, you pick the richest, and this richest is the one that is in charge of creating the next block. And each time, of course, you will have balance that will change from one block to another because you include more transaction over and over, and then you will have different leaders for each block. That's an interesting idea, but still there is the problem of a transaction that can be later revoked because this kind of system are not really are really like Nakamoto style consensus somehow. So to actually address this last point and to not to avoid transaction to be later revoked, there is another class of blockchains that emerged. And for instance, this is Algorand, this is Tendermint using Cosmos, this is Tendermint using Tezos, in which actually the proof of stake is coupled with a Byzantine-Fortran distributed consensus. So it's pretty similar somehow in the principle, because the basic idea is to select not a leader, but a committee. But it's the same. This is selected on the basis of the stake, so the ranking on the balance that are in the register in the blockchains, in the blockchain. And then as soon as a committee is formed, this runs a form of Byzantine tolerant consensus. I say form because, of course, purists can say that what is run in Algorand is not the same that is run in Tendermint. There are different algorithms, but the idea is that these algorithms are there to solve consensus in presence of Byzantine adversaries, which means process that can deviate from the prescribed protocol in any possible way. What is interesting here is that the selection procedure for the committee is verifiable, of course. So every non-committee member, so those that are outside the committee, can just verify signatures of the committee, and they don't even need to go for verifying the content of the block if they trust the committee, of course. A transaction here is finalized as soon as it's included in a committee, in a committed valid block. So as soon as a committee produces a block, this is committed and transaction inside are finalized, and these transactions are not revoked later. And I will put here an example. I say that all these different platforms are using different kind of Byzantine tolerant consensus. There is the Tendermint core platform that use a particular algorithm. And what is important to say is that actually this algorithm is as a kind of voting procedure inside. And normally assigns this, if the committee assigns n, we have that n is equal to 3f plus 1, where f are the number of Byzantine participants. So this is the tolerate thresholds. Okay, we cannot tolerate more than 1/3 of Byzantine participants. And the voting procedure to tolerate these guys, it's a bit difficult to explain, but just to give you an idea, in practice, you have always a leader that proposes a block, and the proposal is accurate if actually we have at least 2f+1 proposal for the same block that are collected. Then any committee member will vote for it. And the committee member finally commits the block when he sees that 2f+1 already voted for it. This is just to be resistant to this Byzantine, but also to be resistant to network bad behaviors. And in fact, that is important to say that this particular class of protocols are resistant to a period in which the network misbehaved somehow. So a block is eventually committed here in an eventual synchronous system, means that after a period in which the network misbehaves, we will have a period in which the network will behave somehow. And in any case, even though the network will misbehave for the whole time, no more than one block is ever committed. So we prove the correctness of this particular algorithm, so this Tendermint core blockchain, but only in a context in which we have correct and Byzantine participants. So there is no rationality here. We really need to go further. Why I say that? Because of course these blockchains are used as blockchain consensus. So they are also providing incentives to participants, and or at least are supposed to provide economic incentives. In particular, what is costly here is block verification, because in any case you need to verify blocks, but you also to participate as a committee member to the consensus. And there you have communication costs, because voting procedures actually imply communication between participants. And then the idea is to have rewards for all these guys. And this is exactly what happens today in Algorand, in Cosmos, in which we have these kind of rewards. So the question now is exactly the same way in which Bitcoin has been analyzed from a rational point of view. Question is how we can analyze this kind of protocols that are supposed to be also tolerant to adversaries. So in the sense that we want to know if incentives drive this voting-based consensus somehow under a model that is rational. But we also need to include adversarial behavior, right? Because we always have those that want to disrupt consensus. As this is why you have a Byzantine fault tolerant consensus protocol there, to be resistant to Byzantine guys. So, and the other question is, when you have rational guys, are you sure that they will coordinate, they will go through the voting procedure as expected? So the basic question is consensus achieved, or also which equilibrium we can have without consensus? This is also something that we want to know. So the exploration started considering that, of course, distributed computing, game theory, that are the two frameworks in which we can put our study, have similarities, but also many differences. In particular, distributed computing is really concerned with the interaction among correct processes with 40, in that case, Byzantine processes, who can take any arbitrary action to disrupt our blockchain consensus. And in particular, as I said before, a Byzantine tolerant distributed protocol is a set of computation and message exchange. In general, you have a program that is executed by each process to solve a given problem, that in this case is consensus, despite the presence of Byzantine process. This is the focus in this case of distributed computing. Game theory, it's a little bit different because it's, of course, about interaction among a set of guys, set of rational players that are respond to incentives and are respond also to costs, and in which interacting choices produce outcomes with respect to their preference, sometimes utilities, and these outcomes sometimes are not really intended by agents. Okay, so there is some outcome appearing. These are interacting, following their best, the best response, and then the outcome will be something that we need to study. When we say outcome, we are talking about, of course, consensus. And it's important to say that consensus is not something, it's something really formal somehow, that actually is stated through three different properties. And one is termination, which means that in the case of our committee, means that eventually a block should be produced. So every non-adversary participant commit on a value. Agreement, if there is a non-adversary participant that actually commit on a value in a block, the other that is not adversary should also commit on the same value. And then we have validity, which say that the committed value should be valid. And when we say valid, this is completely application dependent. This is also called external validity. By the way, Christian introduced this concept some years ago. And in our case, validity here is the validity of the block, so validity of transactions, validity of signatures, and other stuff. By the way, in the rest of the talk, processes, players, and participants, I will actually use the terms in a way that is interchangeable. So to study our problem, say consensus with rational players, with adversaries, and with protocol, that actually is the way in which these agents interact, we need to find a unified framework, right? To do it, we assume then that all players are rational, okay? And all of them play best responses, but they can have different preferences. On another terms, we have two types of players that are opportunistic, in which they just maximize expected net rewards, and adversaries that seek to disrupt consensus properties. So the properties that we have seen before. And under this framework, we can formalize the voting procedure as a dynamic game with asymmetric information. Why? Because players, in particular opportunistic players, doesn't know who the adversary are, and and make an analysis to see if consensus arise in this game under a solution concept that is Nash equilibrium, but adapted to a dynamic game that is repeated because the voting procedure is repeated with asymmetric information that is called perfect Bayesian equilibrium. And then we also have the story of the protocol, right? What is the protocol, by the way? So the protocol is a medium used by agents to interact in the blockchain. A prescribed protocol already exists. What is a prescribed protocol is actually the protocol that you download by internet when you want to be a miner of Bitcoin. You download the code, right? This is a protocol. This is the protocol that designer had in mind. But the agents can modify this prescribed protocol to enact their own strategies. And that's the point. They can somehow hack the protocol and to enact their strategies. And so the basic idea is to look at our problem and going from a prescribed protocol, formalize the dynamic game of the voting procedure, see if this dynamic protocol is a Nash equilibrium, learn about other equilibrium that actually can arise even out of consensus, without consensus, and going back to the protocol to see if we can modify the protocol to get a good equilibrium and to achieve consensus. So the voting procedure that we are considering is very, very simplified with respect to the Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus we have seen before. In practice, we have committee members that interact during a sequence of rounds. At the beginning of each round, we have just one committee member that is the proposer that just send a block to the others. When receiving a block, actually, the other committee member decides whether to check or not the validity of the block and whether to send the vote or not. This is what is also called the action space of these agents, considering that checking validity and sending messages at cost. Then when a block receives a quorum of votes that is greater than the number of adversaries, the maximal number of adversaries that we can have in the system, then this block is committed and added to the blockchain. Otherwise, if the quorum is not reached, we move to the next round. If a block is committed, then all the opportunistic players will get a reward. If an invalid block is committed, opportunistic player will incur a big cost, which reflect actually the reputation loss of the blockchain which they participate and hold the inactive currency, because actually they committed something that is not valid at all. So just to give you a very simple idea about that, so it's in this execution example, we have the proposal of the block, all the guys that actually check the validity, threshold is actually there, so for the quorum, so the block is committed. We make some assumptions, so all the message sent or received at the end of the round. So in some sense, we are in a synchronous system, and proposer can only propose one block in each round, which implies in practice that we don't have problem of agreement in this particular setting, because it's a very strong one somehow, but still we have consensus properties to achieve that are validity and termination. And we will see that in our setting, these two properties are not always there. Also to say that if actually the quorum of votes for a block is not there at the end of a round, there is all the players go to the next round. So moving to the next round means to having another proposer. In particular, the end participants are ordered, and participant knows the index, his own index, and then they actually move in round robin fashion. So this is what the prescribed protocol could look like. And in particular, we need to say that if I'm the designer doing this particular problem, we'll not read the detail because it's exactly what I said before, it's just pseudocode, consensus is reached. But at the same time, the prescribed protocol implements also a strategy profile. What does it mean? It suggests the same strategy for each player. And we will see if this actually strategy profile is a Nash equilibrium or not. In practice, what the agents can do, other than the action prescribed by the protocol. We say that proposer can actually propose a valid block or an invalid block and broadcast the block. And as a voter, actually can decide to check the validity or not. If I check the validity, of course, if the block is valid, I can choose to vote or not to vote. If I check the validity, the block is not valid, I can again choose to vote or not to vote. If it is not, the block is not valid, if I choose to not check the validity, I have no validity information about the block, and I cannot still decide to vote, even though I don't know if the block is valid or not to vote. This is what we call the action space. Before entering and before studying if actually the protocol is a Nash equilibrium, we need to also define what are the objectives actually of the different types of actors. And in particular for opportunistic players, their own objective is to maximize the expected gain. We say that actually checking validity as a cost, sending voting messages as a cost, and after each round, if a block is committed, it will the opportunistic player will get a reward. That of course is a reward that will cover the cost, is bigger than the costs. And on the other hand, if an invalid block is committed, then this type of opportunistic player will incur a big cost. For adversary, they have preferences, and this is different than from the opportunistic, of course, and they have lexicographic preferences over the outcomes. In fact, they prefer that the block will be produced and will be committed as a non-valid block. So they prefer that actually to inflict the maximal damage to the system. At the second place, they prefer that the block is never produced, and then as a last choice is to actually get consensus somehow. So they want to destroy validity, then as a second preference, they want to destroy termination. Of course, they can set a strategy in the pseudocode. I said before, these things, this action that we've seen, they can choose to do it concretely by modifying the protocol. And this is just to say that here we can have strategies that actually are enacted through the pseudocode. Before saying what could be strategies of opportunistic and adversary, we need to fix the power of adversaries, of course. And we do a very strong, weaker. So we have a power adversary that is not so much somehow, in the sense that we have the number of adversary in the community is of course greater than one. So we have at least one adversary. The adversary knows the types of all participants, so they knows who are the opportunistic and who are the adversaries. So in some sense, this is a strong adversary because they can collude with other adversary. But there is an assumption that say that adversary never have the quorum. So if the threshold is null, the number of adversary is less than this threshold. And on the other hand, opportunistic players always have the quorum. And even though it seems counterintuitive, despite this assumption, termination or validity may fail to hold in equilibrium. So studying the best responses of these guys, we can have equilibria in which termination is not there and validity is not there, even though the adversary has not the quorum. And in practice, what is important to say is that to really study what could be the best response of all these guys, you need to also fix what is called the information set of each agent, because as I said before, we have different rounds. So in each round, the participant will learn about other moves, so other participant moves, and then we'll have kind of information about him, but about the others. And in particular, we have two different kinds of information. At the beginning of each round, information set of the participant has a private information and the public information. And the private information is the type the opportunistic player knows. The opportunistic player knows their own type, and the adversary knows all other types. And what is also important to say is that at the beginning of the voting phase, each participant privately knows whether he checked or not the block, but if checked, he privately knows whether the block is valid or not. But this is really private information. And the strategy is just a mapping information set in the action space. So to conclude the talk, I will go straight to the point on the equilibria that actually we found. So first equilibrium is an equilibrium with no termination. There is an equilibrium in which actually no block is ever committed. So it's a kind of paralysis, and this is happen when an agent anticipates that all the others will not vote. That is very easy. In some sense, the intuition of the proof is that voting is a lost cause, because if anticipates that nobody will vote, it's not my vote that will change the output, because the threshold is always at least 2. So if I send my vote to anticipate that nobody will vote, the threshold is not reached. So that's more or less the intuition about it. The equilibrium with no validity is it's a little bit different in the sense that we have that opportunistic propose valid blocks that vote without checking validity. On the other hand, adversary will always propose invalid blocks and will vote for invalid blocks. In fact, in equilibrium, we have the termination is there, but validity is not always there. I say it is not always there is that if the proposer is actually an adversary, we have no validity. If the proposer is an opportunistic one, we'll have validity. But there are some cases in which you will have an invalid block actually committed. And this is actually, I will not go through all these things, but the idea is that somehow there is a phenomenon of free riding here. And somehow voters are there and there are so many. So if I'm a voter, I think that the others will do the work for me, will do the job of checking validity for me. Since checking validity has a cost, I will prefer that others will do that at the risk, of course, that the block will be invalid. And this is basically the intuition of the proof. Of course, we have some probability, and the nice thing is that to think that the expected gain and the deviation. So if I take the prescribed protocol and I want to analyze if a validator or a voter will have some interest in following the prescribed protocol, I can see that the expected gain following the prescribed protocol is in fact less than the expected gain of just having the strategy of not checking at all and vote the block. So the point is that here checking validity and voting for valid block only is somehow interpreted as producing a public good. And here, opportunistic player free ride on the supply of the public good. As sometimes to solve this problem, you can reimburse the cost of making validity checks and should actually somehow solve the problem. The problem here is that this doesn't work for this proposition for this equilibrium, because validity checks are costly, yes, but are not observable. The fact that they are not observable, you cannot really solve this situation this way. So you need to take this. So we also proved that the prescribed protocol by itself is not an equilibrium. And because we have never say that before, we just say that in the game that actually we modeled, that actually is modeling the voting procedure, you have bad equilibria, but we never said that the protocol itself is not an equilibrium. It could be, but in fact it's not. And the problem is that here, the problem is that, as I said before, the opportunistic player somehow are pivotal in voting when you can have a prescribed protocol that make them pivotal in voting to get the quorum, but not in checking validity. So they really need to check validity to always have a pivotal, to check validity to really be assured that no valid blocks will be ever committed. So question could be, is there any good equilibrium? And in fact, there is one, and in particular, to get this pivotal behavior of voters to check validity. I will not enter in all the details because I know that we don't have so much time remaining, but the idea is of the equilibrium is that actually the voters, validators are separated in two sets. So you have a subset that is instructed to check the validity and vote in the first F rounds, and the others will do anything. And there is another subset of validators that will actually just vote without checking. So if you have a subset that check and a subset that doesn't check. So this is the idea. And then when actually around F plus one is reached, then you have that all opportunistic players send a message without checking. So nobody is checking anything. And in this particular equilibrium, if those are the strategy, this is an equilibrium, and this is also a good equilibrium. Why? Because actually proposed blocked by adversarial prayer are never committed, because actually those that will vote will not vote to reach the threshold, or even the opportunistic one. And if T equal F plus one is reached, so the round T equal F plus one is reached, it means that all the adversary already passed before. And we know that actually there is no more adversary there. So the proposer is, of course, an opportunistic one. It will propose a valid block. Then even though the validators will not check the validity, it will be fine, and one block, valid block, will be committed at the end. So to conclude, what we wanted to know is how to get a good equilibrium. Of course, we cannot get rid of others' bad equilibrium, that's for sure, but at least could we have a prescribed protocol to get a good equilibrium? So a modified prescribed protocol could be the following. The prescribed protocol that we have seen at the beginning, all players are instructed to check block validity. A modification could be to actually instruct to check block validity only those processes that have a particular index lower than a given threshold. And to have these two sets of validators, those that check and those that will not check. It is important to say that in the special case in which actually the threshold is equal to F plus 1, in equilibrium, all opportunistic players are pivotal and then check block validity up to the round F. This is important to say because in this case, particular case, player structures don't depend on their index. So their own strategy doesn't depend on the index. So this implies that to reach consensus, we can do it also with the old prescribed protocol, which instructed all the processes to check the validity, right? So in this particular case, but this one was not an equilibrium per se. Still, we have consensus, and we also have a deviation from the prescribed protocol, which is that at the last round, players deviate from the prescribed protocol because they will send the vote without checking. So they are not following the protocol. So still they are deviating. The prescribed protocol is not in equilibrium, still we achieve consensus, which is something that is quite interesting. Okay, so conclusion, of course, we say that, so maybe the big conclusion I can say is that design a good blockchain consensus protocol with incentives is hard. For this new generation in particular, in which we have voting procedures and coordination problems can really arise. There exists some good equilibria, so it could be nice to find them and to design prescribed protocols that actually get this equilibrium.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. So now if anyone has questions, please unmute yourself and ask. You also have the option, of course, to use the chat if you don't want to speak up. All right, it seems we have our first question here from chat. Tim asks, would it help to introduce slashing for nodes who vote for invalid blocks? So you get punished if you vote for invalid blocks.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting question. The point is, of course, is that we have looked at just one block produced, and we need to extend the study to more block produced. And this is also interesting to see if we can select also committees in a way in which slashing can somehow remove some people from the committee and then having less reward somehow in the long run. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. We were considering to study slashing here.
Okay, we have another question. It seems that this is from Andrea. There is this kappa big punishment. And the question is this kappa big punishment committed to all the nodes?
Yeah. That's why I'm saying before that slash is interesting when you see the story of more blocks, because they can change the story of the guys that are selected in committees more than the equilibria that we see today. This is actually related to this kappa, that is a big punishment, right? So if you have the big punishment, and if you consider that it's a slashing somehow, is the same, you get the same equilibrium. What can change is that in the long run, if you produce more blocks, and that the slashing can change the balance of your wallet, and then this will have an impact on the selection. That's why I'm saying this is a different story somehow.
Mm-hmm. Are there more questions? Feel free to ask them now. Yes, please.
Hi, may I add on top of this? I'm Andrea. That was my question. So, don't you think that I'm not a game theory expert, but don't you think that a punishment that is committed to everybody, in a sense, limits the individual choice? So,
I mean, incentives will. I think that incentives will drive the strategy, but the choice is your action space, right? And the action space could be also to do very stupid and silly things.
Yes, but if no matter what I do, I will be strongly punished because of actions by others, it becomes a bit less important what I do singularly as a single agent. A question, I'm not claiming.
I think that what you're saying is that it's a little bit related to free riding somehow. When it's a lost cause to do something, it is a coordination problem, which if you know that in any case, you anticipate that the others will do only bad things, right? And no matter what you do, you will just try to do anything. And this was the idea of the first equilibrium, right? Which there is kind of paralysis and nobody will vote for anything and you will not have any block produced. So the point is, of course, you need to, it could be the case that the guy will not do anything or will choose to do nothing somehow, but because he's anticipating something, the behavior of the others. Is always, game theory is always about that, right? And even though the big punishment is there, the big punishment is there not in all the cases, right? The big punishment is there only if collectively there is a coordination failure. So it doesn't depend on me only, it depends on me and all the others, right? I don't know if this answers the question.
Any other question? We have time, I guess, for one last question, if anyone has more questions. Now would be the time. All right, it doesn't seem so. So thank you again for this talk. We will now have a break until 6 my time, so that's in about 7 minutes. We will start with the next talk. So see you then. So Frederick, if you want, you can already test your slides now.
Okay, thanks.
In case.
You should see my slides now and hear
Yes.
me and
Yes,
see me.
works. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Excellent.
Then I'm ready when you are.
All right. We wait 1 minute and then we're good to go. All right, welcome back to the second part of Tpbc today. Next talk is about the robustness of transaction ledgers under content preferences. And the talk will be given by Frederick. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Frederick, and I'm going to present to you our ongoing research work. Since we continued working on this topic since the submission, we adapted the title to Revisiting Transaction Ledger Robustness Under Content Preferences. The other participating authors are Bernardo Magri from Concordium Blockchain Research Center at Aarhus University, Ricky Lamberti, my colleague from Robert Bosch Corporate Research, and Professor Sebastian Faust from the Technical University in Darmstadt. So first, let me start with the motivation for this work. In transaction ledger protocols, the miners who are participating in the consensus protocol are responsible for including transactions they receive into blocks, and therefore also for determining the final order of transaction within these blocks. Based on that, Garay, Kiaios, and Leonardos formalized their famous transaction ledger backbone model at Eurocrypt 2015. As a short recap, in their model, the execution of the transaction ledger protocol is driven by some environment Z, which provides transactions on behalf of the users using the transaction generation oracle TXGen. The execution then takes place in the presence of an adversary that might corrupt some of the miners, while the rest of the miners is assumed to behave honest. In their model, they state the liveness property as one of the essential properties of the transaction ledger protocol. Intuitively, liveness says that a correctly generated transaction that is provided to the miners will appear in the ledger if a sufficient portion of the miners behaves honest. In practice, transaction ledger protocols imply incentive mechanisms, for example, fees, to pay the miners for including transactions. The idea is if miners expect rewards for including transactions, they will behave honest and include the transaction as intended by the protocol. But as to be expected from the simplicity of that equation, this is not necessarily true in practice. In fact, incentive-driven miners can in many cases increase their profit by deviating from the intended honest behavior. For example, as a little toy example, imagine a miner participating in an on-chain auction protocol. A miner could try to suppress all transactions that include higher bid transactions than himself, and therefore win this auction for the price of missing out on some fees for the bidding transactions. Clearly, this might be a profit maximizing strategy for the miner, of course, depending on the actual auction and the fees offered by the transaction, but you get the point here. In fact, there are many works that show that incentive-driven miners can improve their utility depending on the content of the transactions they are supposed to include in the ledger. For example, miners can profit from suppressing certain transactions, as in our toy example, or in bribery attacks, On the other hand, miners can also profit from ordering the transaction within a block in a certain way, for example, by front running or doing some arbitrage on decentralized exchanges. Dayan et al. Generalized this profitable deviation from honest behavior as so-called miner extractable value. They say MEV refers to the total amount of Ether or any generic other currency miners can extract from manipulation of transaction within a given time frame. Intuitively, whenever a miner can increase its profit by taking rational actions such as reordering, delaying, or suppressing against transaction it is supposed to include in the ledger, it is called a miner extractable value opportunity, or MEV opportunity in short. The reason why this is even possible is what we call miner dictatorship. Miner dictatorship refers to the issue that in transaction ledger protocols, the miner can basically freely choose from the set of received candidate transaction, the set of transaction to be included in the ledger, and also the order of transaction. This means there is no rule that forces a miner to include a correctly generated transaction at some specific point into the ledger. So the ledger would still be considered as correct if a correctly generated transaction is not included at all. If we combine this with the occurrence of miner extractable value opportunities, we can formulate a new equation to state the main issue behind all of the previously mentioned works, which is that miners can utilize their a priori knowledge of transaction contents to profit disproportionately from taking rational actions against candidate transactions. As shown in the related works, this is not just an inconvenience because miner could profit more than intended, but rather incentive-driven miners with content preferences are indeed a substantial threat to the security of transaction ledger protocols. For example, censorship attack could hurt the liveness, and the time bandit attack could even rewind past blocks, just to mention some of the threats. In fact, achieving basic liveness turns out to be very challenging if miners behave according to content preferences. As an example, imagine a single correctly generated transaction. If for some reason all miners prefer this transaction not to appear on the ledger, it is clear that this transaction will never be included in the ledger. However, in this work, we aim to address the issue of miners utilizing their a priori knowledge of transaction content and analyze what guarantees are possible to achieve in the presence of miners with content preferences. To this end, we follow the previously mentioned transaction ledger model by Garay et al. With the twist that we replace all the honest miners with so-called dictatorial miners. The difference between the honest miners and the dictatorial miners is that dictatorial miners are allowed to take mentioned rational actions against transactions they receive from the environment. As depicted here in this slide, this can be seen as a dictatorial miner running an instance of an honest miner inside. So the dictatorial miner receives the transactions from the environment, stores them in some sort of buffer, and may then decide which of them and in which order are provided to the honest miner instance. The decision of the dictatorial miner is driven by their individual preference over transaction content, the current ledger state, and also coordination with other dictatorial miners in order to maximize their expected utility. Besides that, dictatorial miners behave as honest miners. So note that we do not touch the adversary in our model at all. That means that the adversary could still corrupt dictatorial miners as you would do with honest miners. So the idea of this model is to show that behaving as an honest miner is the dominant strategy for all dictatorial miners participating in the transaction ledger protocol. If honesty is the dominant strategy for all dictatorial miners, then there is no difference between the transaction ledger protocol being executed by honest or dictatorial miners. In this case, we can follow that all the properties the transaction ledger protocol achieves in the model by Garay et al., so with honest miners, are also achieved against dictatorial miners. However, in order to do so, we have to show that for all dictatorial miners, the honest behavior dominates all possible deviations from the protocol. So before introducing our main property of the transaction ledger protocol, I would like to ask and answer one question preemptively. Why do we allow cooperation between the dictatorial miners? Wouldn't it be easier to just start without allowing cooperation between miners? And the answer to this question is, of course, yes, it would be easier. However, if the individual miner cannot profit from deviation from honest behavior, but there exists a coalition that could profit from, then it is reasonable to assume that this coalition will be formed eventually. This eventually also includes the grand coalition of all miners. So I would like to stress that this is by far no claim that all dictatorial miners do always collaborate in practice. But if we want to achieve some actual guarantees against dictatorial miners, then it is reasonable to assume that the grand coalition of all miners will be formed if it is the only individual profitable coalition. Also, Diane et al. Showed formally that cooperation is more profitable in the long run if the individual preference, even if the individual preference of cooperating parties are in conflict with each other. For example, if the miners are competing for some mine extractable value opportunities. So we can follow that there are some dynamic that let the miners tend towards cooperation if it's individually more profitable to do so. The desirable property of transaction ledger protocol we want to achieve against dictatorial miner is called content preference robustness. Content preference robustness, or in short CPR, comprises on the one hand of rational liveness, saying that a correctly generated transaction that is input to all dictatorial miners will appear in the ledger. So this is essentially the same property as liveness stated by Garay et al., but against dictatorial miners instead of honest miners. On the other hand, we want the CPR ledger protocol to achieve rational transaction order preservation, which states that no dictatorial miner can improve its expected utility by reordering transactions received from the environment. Intuitively, this means a transaction ledger protocol is called content preference robust if it is a dominant strategy for dictatorial miners to include all transactions provided by the environment in the received order. One trivial observation here is that dictatorial miners can still freely choose the transactions to include. Therefore, if a dictatorial miner behaves, let's call it somewhat maliciously, and strictly prefers to never ever include any transactions independent of the content of the transaction, there's actually no way we can incentivize this miner to do so. So to circumvent this trivial limit, we have to put a minimal utility assumption. We assume that dictatorial miners expect to profit at least on average from including transactions provided by the environment. However, this does not restrict the individual utility for certain transactions. For example, miners might still improve their utility by not including some transactions. All this assumption ensures is that miners that can only choose between including either all or no transactions at all will prefer to include all the transactions. The idea how to achieve content preference robustness is to prevent the dictatorial miners from learning the content of transactions a priori. This means the content of transaction is hidden when the transaction is published. Miners are therefore not able to learn the content of transaction and therefore include the transaction in the ledger without knowing the content. And once the transaction is finalized in the ledger, the content gets revealed. By finalized, we mean that the transaction is part of the common prefix of the ledger that is assumed to be immutable. For example, in Bitcoin, a transaction is assumed to be final if it is in a block 6 blocks deep into the chain. So as you can see, if the miners don't know what they include and have no way of learning, they can only rely on the expectation. So if they expect to profit from including transaction, they will include. So far, the high-level idea here. With this in mind, we can now state our main theorem, which says that the transaction ledger protocol Pi that is robust, according to Garay et al., which means it achieves liveness for honest miners, is additionally called content preference robust if the transaction generation oracle TXGen is upsilon indistinguishable and the protocol itself punishes upsilon withholding. So what does that mean? Upsilon indistinguishably means that no single miner nor a coalition of miners can learn the content of transaction issued by the transaction generation oracle TXGen before some time upsilon. And on the other hand, that it is efficiently possible to learn the content after some time upsilon. So in our construction, we will achieve this property by leveraging time lock puzzles. On the other hand, if the transaction content gets revealed after some time upsilon, the dictatorial miner could simply agree to wait until this time, wait until they learn the content, and then decide what to do with this transaction afterwards. Therefore, punishing upsilon withholding ensures that delaying a transaction for the time is not profitable for dictatorial miner. In our construction, we achieved this by ensuring that transactions that have been delayed for too long are considered as invalid, independent of the content of the transaction, and therefore provide zero utility to the miners. So in our work, we can now formally show that these properties are indeed sufficient for establishing the desired equilibrium, and therefore are sufficient to achieve content preference robustness. In our construction, we provide a CPR compiler that can take a generic robust transaction ledger protocol and turn it into a CPR ledger protocol. Therefore, our compiler takes the single components of the original transaction ledger protocol and modifies them in a way such that the resulting protocol is content preference robust. In order to do so, the idea is on a high level to have two chains. The first chain, called the control chain, contains time lock puzzles of transactions, where the second chain, called the sanitized chain, must contain the respective solutions to the puzzles. So the control chain determines the set and order of transactions included in the ledger, while the actual state of the ledger is readable from the sanitized chain. For example, our compiled transaction generation oracle TXGen prime generates a timestamp of creation, which is basically the current block number of the ledger. Then it takes the actual transaction generated by the original oracle and the current timestamp. Then it generates a time lock puzzle, including both. And then it publishes the time lock puzzle to the dictatorial miners. When creating a new block, the miners have on the one hand extend the control chain by choosing new puzzles from their buffer. So they choose puzzles they received from the environment. And on the other hand, they have to extend the sanitized chain by providing solutions to previously included puzzles. I would like to stress here that the miners do not have to start solving the puzzles at this point, since the solution to the puzzles has to be provided at this point. Miners may start the computation for finding the solution earlier, for example, at the time they received the puzzle. When reading from the ledger, the sanitized chain contains an ordered list of puzzle solutions. So most of them might contain correctly generated transactions with valid timestamp of the creation time. However, some of the timestamp might be too old if the transaction has been withheld by the miners for too long. In this case, the transaction is considered invalid, independent of its actual content. Moreover, it might happen that some of the time log puzzles contained invalid transaction from the beginning. This is, however, not an issue, since the order of transaction is already determined. It is possible to read the chain of valid transactions deterministically, and from this chain of valid transaction, it is possible to determine the current state of the ledger as in the uncompiled transaction ledger protocol using the respective chain reading function. So to wrap up our work, I would like to discuss some selected aspects of our work. First of all, why do we use time log puzzles? Firstly, time log puzzles guarantee plain text delivery. That means if a miner can be expected to know some puzzle, he can also be expected to learn the solution to this puzzle at some point. Therefore, a miner cannot deny a transaction once its puzzle is included in the ledger. On the other hand, time log puzzles are inherently collision resistant, which means that no coalition can find a solution to a puzzle faster than each miner on its own. Unfortunately, our construction as it is right now requires the miners to compute a solution for each puzzle. But it is possible to choose the hardness parameter of this time log puzzle in a way the solution is available when the miner starts the creation of a new block. Therefore, the effective transaction rate is not affected by the computational overhead if the miners are sufficiently capable of solving puzzles. Besides a short phase at the beginning of the protocol where no previous puzzles to solve are available on the ledger, and therefore the contents cannot, no contents can be revealed. So this is just a short phase at the beginning of the protocol. However, this computational overhead of solving time log puzzles is still an additional computational burden for the miner. But at least we can optimize this when instantiating the time log puzzle scheme for our protocol. For example, by using the recently published chained time log puzzles by Abadi and Kiayos or homomorphic time log puzzles by Malavolta et al. One entirely different approach would be to release the solution of puzzles after some sort of event instead of some predefined time. A scheme for this has been proposed by Liu et al. Using witness encryption and a ledger as reference clock. This would allow us to encrypt the transactions such that the content is revealed if the puzzle is deep enough embedded into the chain for some definition of deep enough. So while this would indeed be a very nice property, this would also be super impractical since the size of the witness that is required for decryption would be about the size of the entire ledger. So this is a little bit of a showstopper here. One other aspect is that our definition of content preference robustness is bound to the indistinguishability of transactions. While this is totally fine in our model, where the transactions are issued by the transaction generation oracle, dictatorial miners are clearly able to take rational actions against any transactions they are able to distinguish. For example, in practice, this means that miners can always prefer to put their own transaction at the first position within a block and therefore open the possibility of front-running attacks. Clearly, this cannot be prevented by denying a priori knowledge, since of course miners always know the content of their own transactions. First of all, this is out of scope of our model, but I would like to stress that content preference robustness can still be achieved for the remaining set of the transactions that are still indistinguishable. But it raises the question if we can prevent dictatorial miners from always preferring their own transaction. And this question is actually subject to future work we're starting to work on. We aim at an actual transaction order fairness guarantee against dictatorial miners that might try to deviate from honest behavior. So as a conclusion, in our work, we introduce the concept of content preference robustness for transaction ledger protocols, consisting of rational liveness and rational transaction order preservation. We show how to achieve these properties against dictatorial miners by establishing honesty as a dominant strategy by preventing a priori knowledge and punishing withholding of transactions. And finally, we show how to transform a robust transaction ledger protocol into a CPR ledger protocol by leveraging time lock puzzles. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention and for having me here. And now I'm happy to take any question.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Yes, if you have questions, unmute yourself or ask in the chat. I already see one question here from Connor in chat. The question is Helix CPR?
Helix is what? Sorry.
I have no idea. So Connor, if you could provide more context for that, maybe? So apparently it's a protocol related to transaction hiding.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I'm not familiar with this protocol, so
okay.
Maybe we can take this question offline and discuss this maybe when I had a chance to have a look at it.
Sure. So are there other questions? So otherwise, I have one. It's more a practical one. So your model assumes that all transactions have the same size, right? Otherwise, I can distinguish them.
Yeah, of course. If dictatorial miners, so the dictatorial miners can see the size of the transactions. So if they are able to distinguish the transactions based on size, of course, they can use this as an advantage. For example, by suppressing transaction of a certain size. Yes, sure.
So would there be, I mean, let's assume we have a system with different sized transactions for different purposes. Is there a nice way to kind of hide them without like blowing up the small transactions in this?
I would assume as long as the miner can somehow extrapolate from the size of the transaction some expectations on the content, it would be at least on some statistical level be possible for the miners to use this information for discriminating or for suppressing transaction. So I would assume the easiest way would indeed be to just blow up all transactions to the same size. Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay. I see. Thanks. All right. Are there more questions? If not, I mean, at least I can't see anyone here. All right. So then thank you again for your talk. And with that, we come to the next talk. Next speaker can already start their slides if they want. I just need to find here my window. All right, so the next talk is by Yoon, and it's about the rational protocol treatment of 51% attacks. 1 second. I think you're muted at the moment. Yes, hi. Now I can hear you. Excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Can you also maybe try the slides? At least on my screen, they seem to be a bit glitched out.
Oh, can you see?
I can see your title slide at the moment.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll stay on the non-full screen. Does this work?
Yes. Yes. Perfect.
Okay,
Excellent.
good.
All right.
All right.
Stage is yours.
All right. So hello. This is the talk for the paper, A Rational Protocol Treatment of 51% Attacks. This is joint work with Christian, Professor Zikas, and I, and it will appear in Crypto this year. So if you read cryptocurrency news, you will see this worrying trend of so-called 51% attacks on usually proof-of-work blockchains. And what happens in these attacks is that attackers will somehow gain a majority, hence the name 51%, a majority of power in these proof-of-work blockchains, and they're able to create forks in the blockchain that are able to revert certain transactions and allow them to double spend a lot of money. So to show you how double spending works, let's give an example in our fictional currency called SADcoin. So on the left, I have a bad guy. Let's call him Henry. So Henry has 100 SADcoins. He asked in exchange whether he can trade his 100 SADcoins for $5,000. And the exchange says, sure, why not? So now Henry puts in a transaction on the blockchain that gives the exchange his 100 SADcoins. And seeing this, the exchange says, oh, that's great. I now have the 100 SADcoins. And the exchange agrees to give Henry his $5,000. So at this point, the trade is supposed to be done. But in the case of double spending, Henry somehow is able to create a longer chain, the one in red here, which is made privately by Henry, who has some majority of hashing power, which again, hence the colloquial name 51% attack. And what happens then is that since this red chain is longer, when honest parties see this red chain, they will revert to this, they will turn to this red chain and basically throw away this gray chain that has the transaction that gave the exchange the 100 SADcoins. So in the end, Henry ends up with both the $5,000 he got from the exchange and also the 100 SADcoins, which he is able to double spend for later. But this kind of thing is really not supposed to happen because of a property that's very common in blockchains called consistency. And consistency is really supposed to prevent the problem of double spending. So what's consistency? Consistency says that if you remove the most recent blocks in the blockchain, the rest of the blocks are supposed to be so-called immutable. And the number of blocks that you removed is called the cutoff parameter. So to break consistency, you have to break at least one of two assumptions. The first is that you have to break the assumption of a bounded total hashing power in the system. And this assumption is basically so that blocks are not made too quickly and the honest parties' views are not too divergent. And the second assumption, which is the one we'll focus on, is that you need the the majority of hashing power in the system to be honest. And this is the assumption that's broken by a 51% attacker. And again, the 51% is just a colloquial name referring to any attacker that has a majority of hashing power and not just 51%. And when consistency is broken, we say that there is a fork in the blockchain. So I'll give an overview on our contributions. First, we'll model 51% attacks in a framework called Rational Protocol Design. And second, I will discuss a problem with the previous work called unbounded incentives. And third, I will discuss the question of what makes a coin susceptible to 51% attacks. And lastly, I will discuss how we can protect a coin from these attacks. So let's start with the first question. So now that we've seen that consistency is sometimes broken in certain blockchains, this doesn't really answer the question why some blockchains seem to be more vulnerable to 51% attacks than others. Well, a very intuitive answer could be that attackers don't just attack blockchains for fun. They care about profit as well. And some factors that they might consider are first, the amount that they might want to double spend. For example, the 100 SAC coins in our fictional example. But they also might consider the cost of attack, such as the cost of renting or buying mining rigs and the electricity costs. And lastly, they might care about the block rewards that they might get from just mining. And this attack has been sort of discussed in various different adversarial models and game theoretical models in previous works. So what do we bring to the table? So our work analyzes 51% attacks in a framework called rational protocol design. And it has three main advantages. The first main advantage is that this is a rational cryptographic model. So this is really much closer to the cryptographic analyses that are done more often without the rational aspect. And secondly, there is no restriction on adversarial actions. And this is just a property of this framework because it's based on the cryptographic model. And what this means is that if we're proving the optimality of some action, then this is against all possible adversarial actions. And lastly, RPD is a composable model, so it's compatible with UC, which means that if our protocol is composed with other protocols, then our analyses still hold. So to see what RPD is, we start with a blockchain protocol pi. So in our heart of hearts, we really want to implement a consistent ledger functionality F. But unfortunately, because we don't have honest majority, we can only implement a weaker functionality weak F, which is inconsistent. And what that means is that it has an additional command that allows the simulator to break consistency. And the goal when we're working with RPD is that we want to show that against rational attackers, that is those acting according to his utility function, we don't actually need the weaknesses in weak F, that is the command that allows the blockchain to fork. We don't need these weaknesses in order to simulate the rational attacker. And if indeed the protocol has this property, then we say that the protocol is attack payoff secure. And in Eurocrypt 2018, BG MTZ proved that the Bitcoin backbone protocol, which is a protocol you've seen in our previous talk, has the property of strong attack payoff security. And strong attack payoff security is a stronger version of attack payoff security, which says not only that rational attackers won't use the weaknesses in the weak F, in fact, the honest mining strategy is going to be the dominant strategy. Well, that's great, but this seems really weird because didn't we just say that a bunch of cryptocurrencies were attacked? So that seems a bit contradictory to the security statement. So to see why that might be, let's take a look at their utility function. Here, I'm using this squiggly equals because this utility function actually depends on the simulator in the ideal world and the environment, which we're gonna omit for simplicity. The first term in this utility function is just the expected total block rewards that an adversary gets. And where the first parameter here, B reward, is just the reward for making a block. And the second term here is just the expected total cost of mining that this adversary has to pay, where this first term here, parameter here in this term, M cost, is just the cost of making one mining query. So
I think your screen is not updated.
Oh.
Yes, I think it's frozen.
Current page right now, current slide right now.
Yeah,
oh.
It shows slide 31.
31. Ah, so you're here. Okay.
It doesn't change. It seems to be frozen.
Oh no.
Maybe try to stop sharing and resharing.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing. Do you see if I change the slide?
At the moment, it's just a blank screen for me.
Oh. Does this work now?
No, I mean, at least for me, still a blank screen.
All right.
Blank.
Yeah.
Let me try that again.
Yeah, it just says you're sharing, but nothing is happening.
Oh. Maybe I'll just try again. Does this work?
No, unfortunately not. Still the same problem for me.
All right.
Does anyone know more about Zoom on how to fix this? Or any ideas for that?
What about leave and join again?
Yes, maybe try that.
Yeah, let me do that.
I think you also need to, yes, perfect.
And let me try to share my screen again.
Yes, now I can see some formula.
Oh, great.
And I'm on page 33. So.
Okay, so you missed a bunch of stuff, but that's fine. So I'll just quickly go through what I just said. So we were on track of learning about why we were able to prove that the Bitcoin backbone protocol has strong attack payoff security, even though a bunch of attacks have been done on the blockchain. So let's take a look at their utility function. As I just briefly said, this first term is the expected total block rewards that the adversary gets, where B reward here is the reward for making one block. And the second sum here is just the expected total cost of mining, where M cost is the cost of making one hash query. So as you see here, there is no term that describes anything with double spending. Well, so very simply, we can just add that. And, oh, I see I'm missing some stuff, but Let's just add the reward for forking. So where F reward here is the reward for breaking consistency, for example, to double spend, such as in our previous example is the 100 stack coins.
1 second. On which slide are you now?
I'm on 37.
Yes, it's still frozen for me on 36, unfortunately.
Oh no, that's too bad. So maybe I can try to share a different screen.
Okay.
Do you see the Chrome?
No, unfortunately, it's still this like black screen for me with the thing we had before. Maybe try to rejoin with Chrome.
That's true. Okay, let me try.
So see you in a sec.
Yep. Oh, hello. Sorry about
Welcome
that.
back.
I don't know what's happening.
Technology.
Yes, great. So let me just share my Chrome and let's see, can you see my Chrome?
Yes, I can
great.
see, and I think now I also see the rewards there at the end that we're talking about.
Good. So I will not tempt fate and try to do full screen. I'll just stick with this. So, all right. Okay, so we were talking about how there was no fork reward in the original utility function, and now we're just adding it. All right. So very surprisingly, actually, we're still able to prove really the same thing as the Eurocrypt paper. We proved that for arbitrarily large but still polynomial size F reward, the blockchain is still strongly attack payoff secure. And how do we do that? We use a proof that's very similar to the Eurocrypt paper. So let's start with any adversarial strategy A1. And we say that, let's say he mines for Q queries. Then his utility is at most the fork reward plus whatever mining profit that he gains from mining Q queries. We want to show that a passive strategy, A2, can gain utility that's better than A1. So how does he do that? So he does so really simply by mining longer. And how much longer? Basically, since we said that the F reward is a polynomial, essentially he only has to mine for a polynomial amount as well. So Q star being polynomial in Q. So that's a very cute way, I guess, of proving that things are strongly attack payoff secure, but there's a problem with this proof because realistically, you have to stop mining at some point. And this means that you can't just simply amplify the amount of passive mining rewards forever. And you can't forever be bigger than any other adversary utility. And this is an example of so-called St. Petersburg paradox, which just says that infinite rewards don't really make sense in real life. So now we get to the second point, which is the problem of unbounded incentives. So unbounded incentives.
Sorry to interrupt. I think it did freeze again. I mean, for me, it's this still secure slide at the moment.
Oh no. Okay.
So I don't know. So chat had the idea of like sharing the window only. I mean, I don't know if you're already doing that.
Yeah, I am sharing the window
Okay.
only. Though. Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe try to log out and log in again or so.
Yeah, or
No
maybe
idea.
yeah, maybe we can start with someone else if that's more.
If you have not shared the full screen to begin with, as in if you were sharing a window before too, then maybe try sharing the screen, the full screen.
Oh, okay. Sharing the full screen. Sure, I'll try that. So I'll go to full screen. Do you guys see something?
No, I mean, for me at least, it's just blank, dark screen. Yeah.
So maybe we can maybe go to some other speaker and I can log out again, and then maybe that might be a solution, or not really solution, just.
Do you have someone else who can share the slides for you, and you just say next whenever you need the next slide?
That's true. Yeah, maybe. That might be nice.
I saw some of your co-authors in the talk,
that's true.
So maybe they can share.
Definitely, I wrote you on Skype.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me give you my slides.
Unless a problem occurs with my machine too. Who knows?
Oh no.
I have no idea. I mean, I'm lucky that I don't have to present.
Yeah, this is not a great technique.
Oh well. So if you already have questions now for the talk, we have time. Please. So please unmute yourself or write the question in chat.
So, okay, since there's silence, let me see if you ask the question. So Yun, so I'm just trying to understand a little bit about the logic here. So you're saying that the 2018 Eurocrypt paper proved that it's a already strong payoff, payoff secure. And now your work is what, to strengthen this? Or I didn't quite understand the relationship of this work with the BGMTZ.
Oh, yeah. So as we showed, or we will show, I guess, this BGMTZ showed that things are strongly attack payoff secure, even though in reality, this is really not true. And so our first contribution is to just say why there is such a discrepancy between sort of what's proven theoretically and what's reality. And so we want to basically make their model or make their utility function much more closer to reality, so that we can prove some things that are actually happened in reality. So that's our goal, basically.
So the forking term that you added to the utility, is that already in the BGMTZ, or is this something you're adding on to explain this?
Oh no, so their paper doesn't have this F reward. So our first sort of step was to just say, what if we just added this F reward? What would happen? Like, would we be able to prove the same thing or not? And so, in fact, we're able to prove really the same theorem as BGMTZ.
Oh, so it's not sufficient to just modify that to explain the discrepancy. Right?
Yeah. So this utility function, it's in itself is somewhat flawed, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I guess can everyone see Christian's?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, very good. Okay, please continue.
Okay. So I guess Christian, can you go to the slide with the explodey thing thanks. So next slide. Yeah, well, okay. So let me just pedal back a little bit. Oh, okay. As we were saying, there's this problem of unbounded incentives, which is that the proof technique that VGMTZ used was that they were counting on the fact that the passive adversary can sort of unboundedly increase his passive mining utility. And we formalized this sort of property of utility functions as a term called unbounded incentives. And we show that unbounded incentives is pretty bad because we can show that for any protocol, no matter how good or bad this protocol is, it's going to be proven strongly APAC-PL secure if the utility function of the attacker has this unbounded incentives property. So next. All right, thank you. So to avoid the problem of unbounded incentives, we introduce a really natural sort of alteration of this utility function called limited horizons. And limit horizons first, we change the block reward, B reward from a constant parameter to a non-increasing function. And we say that utility function has limited horizons if there is a round R such that after this round, the expected profit from passive mining is negative. So at some point, it's not going to be profitable to just passively mine. And limit horizons is actually really useful because it allows us to both analyze the case where ATAC-PL security is broken and when it's achieved. Next, please. So now we're onto the point of what makes a coin susceptible to 51% attacks. So we show very roughly that for limited horizons utility functions, both ATAC-PL security and strong ATAC-PL security are not possible if the lower bound utility of a forking adversary is greater than the upper bound utility of an optimal passive adversary. And this is kind of, sorry. And this is kind of clear, just the way I'm writing it. So now the question is, what are the actual two terms in this inequality? So let's start with the upper bound optimal passive mining adversary. So for reference, this is the utility function that we're using. So next, please. The first observation is that since we're working with a passive adversary, the probability of a fork is going to be negligible. So we can ignore this term for now. Yes, thanks. And the next observation is that the first term can be upper bounded by replacing the event where blocks enter the ledger with the event where blocks are made. And this is true since by limited horizons, B reward is a non-increasing function. Next. And now we can basically simplify this two terms, these two sums by putting them together, and I'll skip this for time reasons. Thanks. So for the lower bound utility of a forking adversary, let's just use a very simple attack. So this attack is just that the adversary will work on a chain, which is the in red here, which he keeps private to himself. Next. Since the adversary has a majority of hashing power, his privately kept chain, which is the red one here, will grow faster than the honest party's chain, which is in the gray and on the below. So at some point, if he releases his red chain, he will cause a fork, for example, by reverting the supposedly immutable green block here. Next, please. Thanks. And how long this takes depends basically on the growth speed of this lower chain. And this is given by a very well-known property called chain growth. Next. Given that this is time TQ, the lower bound of this utility of this forking adversary is just the expected block profit, mining profit he gets, plus the fork reward, which he gets with overwhelming probability. Next, please. And finally, we can get to the question of how can we protect a coin from 51% attacks. So recall that we don't have a restriction on adversarial strategy. And also, we don't have assumption on honest majority, only that attackers are rational. Next. And we answer the question, how much confirmation time is sufficient for a block to be immutable in the blockchain? Next, please. In order to do so, we borrowed from the model of BGKRZ20, which describes a 51% attacker by the amount of budget that he spends. So we say that an adversary spends some budget B if he makes a total of B mining queries over the majority of hashing power. So very, very roughly, if the total mining power in the system is 100 mining queries per round, and the adversary makes 51 queries in one round, then he spends a budget of B equals to 1 in this round because it's 1 over the majority of 100. And the idea is that how we answer our question is that we start with a limited horizons utility function UA. And using this limited horizons property, we can come up with a upper bound utility U of BT, which is the upper bound utility of an adversary who spends a budget of B over some T rounds. And given this upper bound utility, we can find the biggest B and T such that U of BT is greater than 0. And that just means that it's even profitable to go over the majority of hashing power. And finally, given this biggest B and T, we can amplify the cutoff parameter, which we recall is the number of blocks you remove from the recent number of blocks you remove so that the rest of the chain is going to be immutable. And we amplify this cutoff parameter to accommodate all adversaries that are spending budget B over T rounds. Next, please. Because graphs are important, we include a graph that visualizes 51% attacks for Ethereum Classic. And just for reference, these are numbers from Ethereum Classic in February of this year, which is at the time of writing. And since we're using limited horizons, I'm using T equals to 3 days as the maximum interval time where passive mining is on expectation profitable. And this is just sort of for the purpose of this graph. And on the left of this column, this is the price of mining 1 unit of hashing power, which I said is just 435 hashes per second. And on the right is the length of attack. And of interest is that at the time of writing, the price of renting is 0.00045, which gives us a length of attack about 2 to 3 days, which is on par with the actual attack from August of last year. And next, if you're wondering, this weird dip is the point where renting for passive mining goes from being profitable to being unprofitable. In summary, I'll just quickly go over this. This is basically we show that realistic utility functions must avoid the problem of unbounded incentives, and limited horizons utility functions, which do avoid this problem, can be analyzed, can be used to analyze both when attack payoff security is broken and maintained. And some future works that might be interesting are implementations, more complex utility function maybe, and maybe of more theoretical interest is to expand this work to variable difficulty blockchains by maybe extending from very recent analyses. And could you just go through the next pretty quickly? These are just the references of papers I refer to in the talk. And thanks for watching.
Thank you for this interesting talk.
Very, very interesting both.
I liked
what
it.
actually happened.
So we have time for one short question. Now is the chance to ask. You can also post it, of course, in chat.
Or offline as well.
Sure, yes. I mean, otherwise I have a quick question. So you mentioned like, more complex utility functions. What would be kind of the next one? Or what could you add like to make it more interesting, like the next step? What would that be?
Yeah, so I was thinking that I think the way I added the fork reward is a bit simplistic. So I just say, okay, you get this fork reward if you fork, and then you don't get it if you don't fork. But of course, a blockchain can be attacked like multiple times. And, these attacks might even sort of overlap each other. And that might be a very interesting question because, of course, this is quite a realistic way of like we're worried about blockchains being insecure. So that could be like a start just on top of my head.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
All right. And with that, we come to the last talk of today's session. So next speaker can start sharing their slides.
Yeah.
So the next talk will be about post-quantum security of the Bitcoin backbone. And Alexandru will give the talk.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, I can see a title slide at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I will be talking about post-quantum security of the Bitcoin backbone protocol and the quantum multi-solution Venn research. This is a joint work with Juan Garay, Aggelos Kiayas, Fang Song, and Petrus Walden. So firstly, to present some motivation, as we all know, Bitcoin is the first and most popular decentralized cryptocurrency. It can build a public distributed ledger. And the Bitcoin backbone protocol, that was also mentioned in the previous talks, is an abstraction that captures the essential features to formally treat the security of the Bitcoin. And the security, at the basis of the security, lies the concept of proof of work, in which essentially parties are proving that they're spending some computational resources. But now in the quantum landscape, we know that quantum computers can promise, in some cases, significant computational advantages. And in this work, we propose to study how the security of the backbone protocol would change in the setting in which adversaries would possess quantum computers. So firstly, I would like to give some very quick quantum background. So as we have in the classical computers bit strings, in the quantum keys, we would have qubit strings, which can be thought as vectors. And then a general quantum state is basically just a unit vector, which is composed of qubit strings having complex coefficients. So such an example is the state psi, which is a superposition between the state 0, 1 with coefficient 1 over square root of 2, and the state 1, 0 with coefficient I over square root of 2. And one way to manipulate quantum states is through gates, which are essentially linear maps. And such an example is the Hadamard gate, which essentially maps 0 to an equal superposition between the 0 state and the 1 state. Another important concept in quantum computing refers to quantum measurements, which are probabilistic in nature. So if we have a state phi, which is the superposition sum over x, ax, and the state x, then the measurement would result in obtaining some outcome x with probability ax squared. Another important quantum notion particular to our work refers to how we are able to access a classical function in a quantum way. So we know that if we have a classical function f, then there always exists a quantum circuit UF, a unitary, which has the following effect. So if we query it with the input state xy, so in the first register x and in the second register y, then UF would map this input to the quantum state x, and in the second register y XOR f of x. And now if we are to use the linearity of the operation UF, then we can actually use superposition queries, and this would lead to obtaining a superposition over AXX in the first register and f of x in the second register. Now, since we mentioned the possible quantum speedups, and since we also want to say something that is relevant to our problem, we can mention the searching. So in a search problem, we have an n-element database, and we know that to find the solution, classically, we just need n queries. But quantumly, using Grover, we know that we only need square root of n, which is also the optimal algorithm. And now I just want to give a very brief introduction to the Bitcoin backbone protocol of Garay et al. So the blockchain is essentially formed of blocks containing transactions. And the backbone protocol is ensuring that parties are maintaining the blockchain in a distributed fashion. Then to generate a new block, parties need to solve a proof of work. And finally, we know that each party has a local chain. And essentially, they are trying to update with the longest chain and then extending it. And regarding the security model, we have n parties. All parties are either honest or adversarial, have classical computers. And we have t adversaries and n minus t honest parties. And between these two numbers, there exists an honest majority assumptions, which is required to ensure the security of the backbone protocol. And then in a single round, in order to break a proof of work, each party, either honest party or adversary, has q queries to the function age, where age is essentially modeled as a classical random oracle. Now, in the post-quantum security of the backbone protocol, we model the adversary. First of all, we know that if the adversary is quantum, the most powerful tools he can use is essentially querying H in a superposition. So for instance, as we have seen in the quantum background part, you can perform queries of the type Y1 plus Yn, and this would be mapped to Y1 H of Y1 plus Yn H of Yn. And in our case, we consider that the adversary is a single quantum adversary having capital Q queries, which represent the joint computational effort of all the parties under his control. So a proof of work is essentially just a mean for a party to convince that he has invested some effort for solving a task. And this task is particularly finding a witness Y such that age applied to X and Y is less than D, where X represents the hash of the previous block. And D is some parameter known as the difficulty level of the proof of work. And then once a party is successful in producing the proof of work, he can add a new block to the blockchain. And now when we talk about the security of the backbone, we mostly refer to the two basic properties, to the common prefix and the chain quality. So the common prefix essentially means that the blockchains held by the honest parties may be different, but they must have a large common prefix. And the chain quality essentially tells that the number of blocks which are created by an adversary in an honest party's blockchain must be bounded. And then in the classical backbone, to show these properties, the analysis was based on obtaining bounds on the number of proof of works broken by the honest players and adversaries within a set of rounds. And lower and upper bounds on these values were mostly derived from the honest majority assumption. So our main results can be summarized as follows. We essentially show that the protocol security, namely that the two properties hold in the post-quantum setting, under the assumption that the quantum adversary is bounded in a suitable way in the quantum random oracle. So what do we mean by a suitably bounded quantum adversary? We essentially mean that as long as we can bound the quantum adversarial hashing power relative to the honest classical hashing power, then the security of the protocol holds. And more specifically, we show that the security holds as long as the quantum queries of the adversaries are such that each of them is worth p to the minus 1/2 of the classical ones, where p represents the probability of success of a single classical query. And another consequence of this is that the wait time for safe settlement, so essentially the number of rounds you need to wait until you have the same level of security as in the classical setting, it actually matches up to a constant the safe settlement time against classical adversaries, which is quite surprising. So let's see what is the underlying abstract problem that the adversary is trying to solve. So essentially, the quantum adversary is trying to produce a chain which is longer than Diana's chain. And to analyze this, we need to bound what is the maximum length of the chain that he can produce. So abstractly, this would translate to a search problem where the output represents a chain of hashes. So essentially, the output of one hash is fed as the input to the next hash. And to be more precisely, the problem chain of posts can be described as follows. So we are given n quantum queries and the starting point x0, as well as n random functions h0 up to hn minus 1, where each of these functions are independently sampled. Then the task is to find the sequence of length k, y0 up to yk minus 1, such that the following recurrent relation is respected. So such that xi plus 1 is equal to hi applied to xi and yi. And also xi plus 1 must be less than this parameter d. So essentially, we can see that directly solving the chain of posts for a quantum adversary is a very complex task. So first of all, we cannot a priori break it into separate search problems. And also, we can also imagine that the quantum adversaries would be able to perform a very complex search type of algorithm to output directly a chain of proof of works. So our approach is to actually use a series of reduction to bound the maximum length achievable for the chain of posts problem. So now to quickly present the proof roadmap we use. So to analyze the query complexity of the chain of posts, we firstly define a simplified problem, which is called K-bear search. Then we find the relation between the query complexity of the chain of posts and the K-bear search problem. And then we focus on analyzing the quantum query complexity of this latter problem. And to do this, we need to derive a threshold direct product theorem for this type of randomized search problems. But I'm going to go into more details about how we are achieving this. And finally, once we established the query complexity of the chain of posts problem, then we can complete the post-quantum security of the Bitcoin backbone by essentially giving tight characterization of the probabilities of the protocol's properties. And essentially, this also allows us to derive a post-quantum honest majority condition, which, as we have seen, essentially represents a relation between the quantum computational hashing power and the classical hashing power of the honest players, and also the required number of rounds for safe settlement in the case of quantum adversaries. So let's see what is the relaxed problem. So the relaxed problem, called K-bear search, is essentially asking for the maximum cardinality of independent proof of works given n quantum queries. More specifically, the K-bear search can be described as follows. So we are given a function f that has single bit outputs, which is generated by the following Bernoulli sampling procedure. So essentially, for each input x, we are going to independently set f of x is equal to 1 with some probability p, which p is some parameter, and with equal to 0 probability 1 minus p. And the task is to find k preimages of 1. So to find x1 up to xk, such that f of xi is equal to 1. And we can see that as compared to the chain of posts problem, now we no longer have the requirement for the blocks being sequential. So we just have a sequence of k blocks which can be independent. And now our goal is to find the relation between the query complexity of the chain of posts and the K-bear search. And specifically, we show that for any adversary having n quantum query, it can produce a chain of length k with probability p1 of nk. And then if for any quantum adversaries a prime having n quantum queries, he can solve the K-bear search problem with probability p2 of nk. Then the following relation must hold between the two probabilities. So specifically, the probability of solving the chain of posts with n quantum queries is less than the probability of solving the K-bear search with n plus k quantum queries. So now it essentially suffices to just study the query complexity of the simplified problem of the K-bear search. And the main question we are asking is, if an adversary has n quantum queries, what is his maximum probability to solve K-bear search? So to find those key preimages. And to do this, we derive a threshold direct product theorem. Technically, this relies on using the recording technique for quantum queries in the quantum random oracle developed by Zandri. but which was developed for uniform distributions. So for functions sampled according to, for functions sampled uniformly. Whereas if we recall, in our case, we had a function sampled from a Bernoulli distribution. So one of our main contribution is to modify this recording technique framework to allow for functions sampled non-uniformly. And this new framework can be of independent interest. And essentially, the main result regarding the query complexity of the K-Bear search problem can be summarized as follows. So if a quantum adversary A has n quantum queries, then the maximum probability that A solve K-Bear search to find K-pair images is essentially E times n times square root of P over K, everything to the power of 2K, where P refers to the probability of a successful proof of work using just a single classical query. And now I want to describe how the recording oracle technique works and how it allows to tell something about the query complexity of this problem. So essentially, this framework developed by Zandri allows to keep track of the quantum adversary's knowledge when interacting with a uniform random oracle. So specifically, if you suppose a uniform sample functions f, then as we have seen in the quantum background part, we can query f in a we can query f quantumly by performing queries of the type xy, which are going to be mapped to xy with an extra phase of -1 to the power of y times f of x. And the key observation in the recording technique framework is that a quantum adversary cannot distinguish between the following two settings. So in the first setting, we have the function f being sampled uniformly at random. And in the second setting, we are essentially adding an extra register, which is going to represent the uniform superposition of all possible functions f. And when I say here get f, I actually mean the table of truth of the function f, which, and very importantly, this extra oracle register is not accessible by the adversary. And to make it a bit more clear, so suppose that an adversary is going to perform a general quantum query. So it's going to be a query of the form sum over xi, axy, state xy. And then the state after the system, after we perform the query, is going to be the same in the input register. And then we can see that actually this phase that we had before, so this -1 to the y times f of x, can actually be moved to the second register. So it can actually appear right here. And this very important observation tells us that a query of the adversary is actually modifying the oracle state. And we are going to actually use the oracle state to learn information about the adversary's knowledge. And as you mentioned before, very importantly, he cannot access this register. So now, to make the presentation a bit easier, I'm going to introduce some notation. So we are going to consider the string p of xy, which is essentially the all-zero string, except that on position x, we have value y. By using this notation, this essentially means that y times f of x is the same as considering the inner product between the string p of xy and the table of truth of the function f. And then we are just going to use the state we obtained, the state of the system after the query, and we just replace the y times f of x with this new expression over here. Well, we can denote this as the primal domain. So this is the state after the adversary performed the query. But now comes the nice observation. So essentially, if we are going to apply Hadamard gates on this second register over here, so on this superposition over all possible functions, this whole state is going to become just the state consisting of the classical string p of xy. So this essentially represents a quantum state having 0 everywhere, except that on position x, we have value y. And we are going to denote this as the dual domain, also known as the Fourier domain, because essentially we apply the Fourier transformation. And then we can also generalize this and say that after t queries of the adversary, the oracle state, so that, that this extra register is just going to become the XOR of t strings of the form p of xy. And this nice observation allows us to keep track of the evolution of the adversary's query in the Fourier domain. So essentially, to do so, we just need to start with the all-zero state. And then after each adversarial query, we are just going to sort to D a value P of xy. So this observation tells us that after T queries of the adversary, the oracle state will have at most T positions equal to 1, because essentially we are just sorting each time with P of xy, which has at most one non-zero position. And this essentially tells us that any event about the adversary's knowledge of the function f, of the underlying random oracle function f, can be translating into investigating some corresponding property of the oracle register, so of this state D. And this is how we actually keep track of the adversary's knowledge about the function f. So in our case, we have to modify this recording technique to accommodate for the keyword search problem. And essentially, we now allow for function sample according to Bernoulli distributions. So as you have seen previously, in the uniform case, each query would had the effect of modifying exactly one position, either from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, of the oracle state in the Fourier domain, so in the dual domain. But now in our case, because we have a function sample according to this Bernoulli distribution, the initial oracle state would be a Bernoulli superposition over all possible functions. Hence, we cannot use this view between the primal and the Fourier domain as before to record the queries of the adversary. Instead, our approach is to consider a different dual domain and then to extend the primal dual domain to accommodate for Bernoulli distributions. Switching between the primal and the dual domain is no longer going to be achieved through this Fourier transformation, so by applying Hadamard gates, but by using a different unitary UP, which has the parameter P over here, and which essentially is mapping the all zero state to the Bernoulli superposition over all possible functions. And intuitively, you can think of UP as just rotating the zero states toward one state using this parameter P. So now, with this observation, we can also keep track of the evolution of the oracle state in the dual domain as we had in the uniform case. So as before, we will again start with the oracle state being initialized in the all zero state. With the main difference is that while before we had switching between 0 and 1 with each quantum query, now we will essentially rotate one of its qubits using this unitary UP. And this means that after T quantum queries, we will essentially have at most T rotated qubits in the oracle register. And the rest of the qubits should remain 0. And essentially, by keeping track in this way of the queries of the adversary, then by just examining how many non-zero entries are in the oracle register, we can tell information about the adversary's knowledge. And finally, in order to say something about the success probability of the adversary, we need to return to the primal domain. And to do this, we essentially need to apply back the unitary UP to the oracle register. But the trick here is that you can see that now if I apply UP to a 0 position and then I apply a measurement, because of the probabilistic nature of measurements, this means that even a query that has never been, even a position that has never been queried before can collapse to a measurement outcome 1. But it's not an issue because this is essentially just capturing the adversary strategy where he's just outputting some candidate preimages which are just random guesses. So essentially, he didn't make any queries to determine these preimages, but he's just making some random guesses for some of the preimages. So essentially, this tells us that analyzing if the adversary was able to solve the K-bear search just corresponds to examining if there are at least K non-zero entries in the oracle register. And then to bound the probability of this latter event, we just need to examine after each query how close we are to the desired oracle state, the one having at least K non-zero entries. So now, now that we have established the query complexity of the K-bear search problem, so now that we have seen what is the maximum probability of the adversary to solve the K-bear search problem, we just need to combine this result with our relation between the query complexity of the two problems, and then we can derive our main result about the complexity of the chain of pose. Specifically, we know that any quantum adversaries having n quantum queries can obtain a chain of pose of length at most k, with this probability over here, where we recall that the P appearing here refers to the probability of a successful proof of work using a single classical query. So now that we have established what is the hardness of the chain of posts problem, we are going to use it to identify the conditions under which the common prefix and the chain parity property can be obtained in the presence of quantum adversaries. And to do so, we are going to proceed similar to the classical analysis. So first of all, we are going to define a notion of post-quantum typical execution, defined in the presence of honest players and quantum adversary. Then we are going to prove that under post-quantum typical execution, the desired properties follow for suitably chosen parameters. Finally, we are going to determine a post-quantum honest majority condition under which a typical execution occurs with high probability. So essentially, this allows us to obtain the following table of results. So essentially, we can tell what is the post-quantum honest majority, which, as we have mentioned before, it represents a condition on the number of quantum queries of the adversary. That specifically, it must be less or equal than f times 1 minus f over square root of p, where f represents the probability that at least one honest party finds a proof of work in a round. And along with that, we can also determine what is the maximum expectation, what is the maximum expectation of adversarial number of proof of works that he obtains during S rounds, and then also the probability of a typical execution. And finally, from the probability of typical execution, we can also determine what is the number of rounds required to reach the same level of security as in the classical setting. And here is where you observe that in the quantum case, it matches up to a constant, the number of rounds in the classical setting. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. So, question time. Unmute yourself or write in chat if you have any questions. So, I have a question. So, do you have any like interesting extensions where you can extend this work or like, you know, port it to some other setting?
Yeah, so actually the first extension that we are looking into, so far in the security model we have studied, we assume that the adversary is a single party that has capital Q quantum queries available. Mm-hmm. So first natural extension would be to see if this adversary has multiple processors that can run in parallel, and then to analyze again the query complexity of the chain of posts problem and see what would change in the analysis. Secondly, a more ambitious goal would be to also assume that we have multiple parties having quantum computers. So on one hand, multiple adversaries having quantum computers that could collude, and that would lead to a very complex analysis. And then even honest parties having quantum computers available that could run inside the backbone protocol. I think this would be the main goals to look at. Okay,
yeah, thanks. So are there more questions, things you want to ask? Yeah, I have another one. I mean, extensions, right? Now you looked at proof of work like Bitcoin, like chain. So what about, say, proof of stake? Any ideas if what you could do there with quantum adversary?
I guess you would just have to redo again all the query complexity analysis for any other underlying problem that lies at the security. So I don't think it would come as a natural extension, but just probably redoing the whole analysis for the proof of stake problem as well.
Okay, thanks. All right. If there are no more questions, then that's it for today. So next week, same day, same time, we have even more exciting talks for you. So hopefully see you then. And yeah, have a nice day. Bye.